the first speaker following on my address would be Mr. Andre de Ruyter, then Mr. Tommy van Zyl. After that, Craig Lembo. All three of them also hold master's degrees and MBAs, and I think in the case of Mr. Lembo too. And then Matlatsi will be the last speaker, but in my presentation I will enlighten a little bit about what you can expect from them. If you have questions to the speaker, we're not going to allow a lot of time for questions and answers, because this is really a prestige day where we present the speakers in terms of a specific topic. Malatsi already indicated to me that she would allow some time for Q&A, which we can do that. And you're welcome to put your questions in the chat box, and I will then use these questions to put to her. I would also appreciate that you mute yourself, and to get the maximum bandwidth, you can also close down your video link or your picture. But if you want to talk or if you want to ask a question, then I will ask you to please activate yourself so that we can see who's talking and we have some sense of where it's coming from. I will stick to the times as indicated, and we have a break from 11 o'clock for about 20 minutes just to refresh and do those normal things that one needs to do in a session like that. But for the rest, we're going to stick to our times and the program as we have published it. From my side also, welcome to everybody in today's Prestige Day. It's part of the winter school. I see we already have 140 participants that have logged in, especially Jan van Romburg mentioned them, the MBA students. This is a special opportunity to listen to gurus in the veld, to listen to people who has experienced things and that can talk to their strengths. And it's very, very seldom that you would get the opportunity to do this. Now, in my case, as the program director, I also opted to do a kind of introduction as to what it is that we would like to get out today. What's the kind of message? And we've decided that we're going to talk about a response to crises. And when we thought about the title and the idea, of course, we had COVID-19 in mind and a few other things. What happened in KZN and Gauteng over the last 2 weeks wasn't part of our thinking when we planned it, but it fits very well into the topic. And I've communicated with all the speakers, and I said they're more than welcome to add and to make reference to the developments from the 7th of July up to now, if it fits in their program and if they would like to do it, because this is in part what we're trying to do. My presentation is going to start. I'm just going to share to the share screen, and the host will enable me sharing capacity. Host, can you please just enable me? You'll have to do that to the other speakers as well. Yes, I'm enabled, and I open my share box, and let me just open this thing fully. There we are. I refer to my topic as the parameters of a crisis response. The purpose of my talk was to give an outline of the experiences that I've had over a period of about 37 years at a university with crises and beyond that, and to build that into existing academic frameworks and add some of the views that I've developed over time. My normal approach would have been that of a political scientist, but today I move out of that ambit and I move into the field of management and the field of crisis management, those kind of areas that I used to do when I was the deputy director of the Institute for Future Studies. We worked a lot with these kind of issues. Now, the first part is just table of contents. I'm going to deal with 6 issues, including a 7th point, which is the conclusion, and that is to make a fairly comprehensive introduction, to explain a little bit about the context that I see it in, defining crises, looking at process, linking process and strategy in terms of what we're doing, and then focus on leadership. I think leadership is such an important issue in managing of a crisis, understanding of a crisis, leading a crisis, that you will see reference to leadership in several of my slides. But just before I somebody is, no, I'm not muted, sorry, I just saw on my box. You'll see several references to that throughout the presentation. The first slide that I will show you is the introductory slide, and in that I am referring to South Africa that presents unique conditions to manage crises of different types. And this is almost an understatement in terms of what we are witnessing over the last few weeks in the country, including issues such as the troubles with Eskom and the troubles with state capture and a few other things. And in my second bullet, I'm trying to actually show that we've ended the COVID pandemic last year in a weakened economic state, undermined by state capture. So by the time we entered the COVID pandemic, like the rest of the world, we already had issues that qualifies to be referred to as crises in some form or another. My third bullet is that if COVID represents a black swan event, now in the language we're using, a black swan event is something that nobody could predict. It is something that came out of the blue and caught everybody off guard, to use those words. If that was a black swan event, which most of us think, then we've added over the last week or two a political and socio-economic crisis and issues that go with that to it by the dramatic events from the 8th until the 17th of July 2021. So what we have experienced is very similar to what the Americans experienced last year. In the midst of their second wave of COVID, they had Black Lives Matter as an issue. And it's very difficult to manage the one big issue, the disaster called COVID-19, and then within the disaster, a crisis. South Africa is exactly at that point. And the questions that I'm asking is, how do we manage these complicated situations? And I think I would like to present some ideas based on the experience that I've developed and I've built over the last few years. I was in the fortunate position Once that I moved out of teaching, I served as special advisor to 2 vice chancellors from 2004 up to 2016. And in those positions, typically of universities, you confronted with crises all around the time, and different types, and things that you were not prepared for in any way. Now, my second slide on the introduction is that it is normal for people to follow a crisis, or following a crisis, to start looking for a culprit, or to start a process of destructive self-criticism. It's a very, very normal process, and I'll refer to that later on as well. We see both currently in the media and the social media, and Matlatse will refer to this in a talk as well, the role of the media in these kind of issues. And I see the politicians are also playing along, accusing each other, just to spice it up in South Africa at the moment. However, it is crucial to be able to see the strategic solutions from within the crisis. And this is where I integrate my view on the role of leadership in a crisis. People with strategic mindset have the ability to look at the horizon and not to be consumed by the chaos and the corruption caused by such a crisis. And that is where a special type of leadership emerge in times of crisis. So that's one of the interesting positives, that you not only see the fault lines of society in times of crisis and disaster, but you also have a very clear idea who can lead you out of it, who can actually take society by the hand, or take the organization by the hand, or whatever, and provide leadership. What happened in KZN and Gauteng over the last 2 weeks is exactly such a situation where leadership is now of a prime condition and orientation. Now is the time to think strategically and to be constructive, and not to fall victim of anxiety, ambivalence, and indecisiveness, which is, again, a normal kind of reaction when you have a crisis like this. Now, what is a crisis? Let me broadly define it. A crisis is a very broad term that is frequently used by politicians and academics and business leaders. A general definition of a crisis is simply a breakdown in the system, and that creates stress. It's a definition that was designed by P.W. Perry. Most literature on crises and disasters focus, however, on organizations rather than the biggest failure, regime failure, or governance. South Africa is basically confronted with 2 or 3 of these types of crises, both at the organizational level, at the regime level, and with COVID, we've got a crisis on a global level. So we are confronted with all the types and the presentations at several levels. South Africa, however, has had its share of regime crises. Later on, I'll refer to some of the dates and the places, with a national impact on politics, the economy, the business climate, and confidence in general. And COVID-19 represents a global crisis and a disaster that requires a fundamental rethink of how we go about doing things. And that was why when we planned this Prestige Day together with Professor Christo Bishop and the executive school director and a few others in the team, that we selected specific people to participate today, because we thought all of them can make a very constructive contribution to this discussion. One example of COVID-19, and I'm not going to discuss it, I'm just going to show it to you, was the book written by Fareed Zakaria, the well-known author that you will see on CNN regularly. And he refers to it as 10 lessons for a post-pandemic world. In that, he tried to do exactly what I explained earlier on, and that is to be in a crisis and to start looking at the horizon, say, where are we going? I'm just going to focus on 3 or 4 of the issues that that is mentioning. Look at lesson 3. Markets are not enough. In other words, we have a situation where people think that the free market can deal with these issues. It's clear that governments must also come to the party, and that part of the solution is in the working together of governments and markets. Lesson 4 is a very important one. People should listen to the experts, but at the same time, the experts should listen to the people. In other words, there should be two-way communication, and the experts must take note. When people are telling them that the lockdowns are too stressful, that when people tell them that certain things isn't working, I think it's a very important point for them to listen. We use Zoom as a digital platform, and that's exactly his lesson 5. Life is digital, but I also think Jan referred earlier on to lesson 6, that Aristotle was right. We are social beings. We would like to see each other from time to time. We would like to have some coffee and to do eyeball-to-eyeball discussions, see each other, witness what we're doing, and those kind of things. And then lesson 7 is very important for South Africa as well. Fareed Zakaria predicted that inequality will actually get worse during the pandemic, because the fault lines will show up and it will be more acutely experienced by people in countries, especially countries like South Africa, Brazil, Poland, Malaysia. We can mention several countries in the world that is looking like us with exactly the same kind of problem. And look at his conclusion. And his conclusion is nothing is written. In other words, we entered this pandemic as a crisis, as a disaster, without a handbook. It was very difficult for us to look back 100 years to find out what happened in the previous big pandemic, which was the Great Flu after the First World War. And we developed processes and we developed protocols as we go along. And as we talk, the medical fraternity is still trying to understand exactly what this virus can do and what it cannot do. And it is my experience that they are learning on a day-to-day basis what we're dealing with here. Now, important on a crisis response is that we've invited 4 participants to share with us thoughts. The first participant that joined us, Mr. Andre de Ruyter, will talk about energy and the provision of energy as a global challenge and a very specific South African crisis. I'm looking very forward to his perspectives on these issues. Before he starts, I will provide a little bit more of his CV, and you will see that he's eminently qualified to deal with that topic. We have invited Mr. Tommy van Zyl to share with us on how agriculture has dealt with not only one, but several crises over years in the agricultural field. If it is not only the marketing of products or the logistics to get the products to where they're going, or with labor-related issues, or with policy issues, or at the moment, the whole question about land and the change of the Constitution, Article 25, all of these things are put on the table of agriculture, the agricultural sector. And Tommy, I'm sure, will give us a very interesting perspective on how to deal with these matters. Craig Lembo from the Research of Economic, or the Bureau for Economic Research, Stellenbosch, are going to give us some insights on how COVID impacted on our spatial considerations. We are sitting basically in our studies talking to each other. The corporate world has sent a lot of their people home. Ever going to return? How is that going to impact on the building industry? And how are we going to do this? I'm sure Mr. Lembo doesn't know all the answers because nobody does, but he can share with us what the statistics are telling us and how industry is already placing themselves. On this topic, we have decided to have a think tank later this year, maybe in a month or two, on especially how COVID has impacted on the organization and what are the issues regarding relationships at work, the whole issue of labor relations. And we've asked one of our colleagues to take the initiative in doing that, but we'll let you know when that product is ready to be presented at the think tank level. And then lastly, we have invited Matlatse Matlase, a very seasoned journalist, to give us a perspective on the media. But I also asked her to pay special attention to the social media, because that's the one area that has changed completely in terms of a crisis response. Previously, we could have dealt with the media in the conventional sense. We could have dealt with the radio. We could have dealt with all the communication channels, and sometimes they were, of course, managed by governments. But with the social media, it's a different kettle of fish. The social media is generating its own news. Every individual is actually becoming kind of a broadcasting station. And this has tremendous impact on how crises are developing and how crises develop over time. My next slide is the fact that if you look at crisis response, unprecedented crises demand unprecedented actions. In other words, you just cannot do the same thing that you've done previously. Lessons past suggest also that leaders are more likely to underreact. Take note of that. Leaders tend to underreact. In other words, they play safe. Politicians do that. Business leaders do that. Universities do that. What is necessary is to take the bold and the rapid action that would normally be too risky. But that is probably the approach to follow when you're in such a deep crisis and you need to make things different and difficult. So decision-making, of course, is not easy in these times. That is a given. And business leaders cannot afford to wait for when events are moving. They can't wait to make these decisions because events are moving so fast. So you need fast action in a time where uncertainty is at its highest. And I'll get to that right now. And then one of my first references to leadership. Leaders with the right temperament and character are necessary during times of uncertainty. They stay curious and flexible, but they can make the tough calls, even if that makes them unpopular. Very important point, in my view, about the leadership mindset in times of a crisis. Now, the next is just a little tongue-in-cheek. We're talking crises, and we're playing with the bullets, but this slide and this cartoon is from the United States. I follow the media in the United States very regularly, and they refer to the COVID virus this year as the comeback kit. So although the vaccination rates are very high, they still have a major portion of people that has got a problem with vaccinations. And their statistics show at the moment that upwards of 80% of people who land in hospital are those that haven't been vaccinated. So the vaccination provides some form of protection. But there you can see the cartoon. And a similar cartoon from South Africa to show that the media is providing comment on this all the time was this by Zapiro recently as a government response to the developments in KZN and Gauteng. As you can see, each one of these four actors providing a different take on what is going on in the country. The president wanting to have another family meeting, our Minister of Police acting the way he does, even with a hat on, and we have the intelligence services playing their part, and we've got some ministers providing their version that is not necessarily the official version of government. But I would like to show the context in terms of a slide. This slide uses two types of statistics. The blue line is the real year-on-year GDP growth. And you can see, if you look at the red line or the blue line, I will show you with a pointer that we had a recession prior to 1994. And then if we follow the line, we had another recession in 2008 when we had the global meltdown and the beginning of the Eskom problems providing power. And then we had a deep recession following COVID-19. So there you've got the major story of the blue line, how the South African economy performed. And you can see that we even had times where the economy performed upwards of 5% in the times of Thabo Mbeki. So there were some very, very good times in the South African economy. The red line is research done by the Bureau for Economic Research, where they ask a question in the manufacturing sector for a period of the last 30, 35 years. A simple question, and the question is, does politics influence your decision making? Now, if you look at this, the red line, you will see that the red line is inverted to make it work with the blue line. So if it is here, it means that a very large portion of the respondents were extremely concerned about politics. And that was exactly in 1993, with the death of Chris Hani and the murders in Takoza and the East Rand, where in 1 month, more than 700 people were killed in political battles. So you can see that and the relationship to the economic data that we got from the South African Reserve Bank. Another point on this line is, of course, here. Here you can see that the political constraint was very low because the economy was performing well. And then a very interesting counterintuitive position on the comparison. Here we are going into a recession, but the political line shows a positive response. Well, you will see what happened here. This was for a brief period when Kgalema Motlanthe took over as president. There was a very positive response to his presidency. And then you can see from there on, it is a downward hill. And this is now commonly known as the 9 lost years. So to make it easier to see what's going on, I shaded the periods where de Klerk was president of the country up to 1994. And then I shaded the Mandela years. I shaded the Mbeki years. Generally speaking, the economy was performing very well, and the political constraint was low in the period where Mbeki was president. Then the white area is where Kgalema acted as president between Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma, and the red block represent the years that President Zuma was president of the country. And you can clearly see what happened in that period. This is a disaster in the making, a crisis in the making. The economy is declining all the time, hitting 0% growth 1, 2, 3 times. And then, of course, going into a deep recession due to COVID. But you can also see the political response. By 2012, the political response was at the same level as about 20 years earlier when KwaZulu-Natal got killed, just to give you a comparative position. So that tells you how negative the responses developed during the Zuma years. When Ramaphosa took over, you can see there was a brief Ramaphoria period, we used to call it then a decline, and then a kind of a sideways move. I would be very interested to see how this slide is going to change in the next quarter, following what happened in KZN, and following a very strong performance of the economy. To put those things that I mentioned in place as a context, I added some of the events just to make it a little bit more visible. That period there was the pre-1994 anxiety. That period there was the global meltdown, something that happened globally but impacted on South Africa. That is when Eskom started with load shedding in 2008. You can see the impact on the economy. That is when Jacob Zuma took over as president of the country. And this is COVID-19, the impact on the economy. And this is the unknown. But we expect that the political constraint will again dip. And we also expect that the economy will definitely show a negative impact on these issues regarding the crisis in South Africa. Now, the context, and I'm showing a map that was published by Mail and Guardian, just to show you what happened in the country over the last weeks. The red dots are the areas where malls were attacked or where there were incidents of some kind. You will see that here in Cape Town, there's no indication because that taxi war there, although it is ongoing and it's negative to the economy of the Western Cape, has no relation to the issues happening here at the moment. And the numbers are now coming through and it is devastating. So the questions that I'm asking, and I'm not providing any answers, I'm just asking in terms of people's announcements. Was this a coup, an attempted coup, staatsgreep? Was this an insurrection that some people claim? Or was this a planned economic sabotage? We're not exactly sure. And one of the things that you need to know in the management of a crisis, you need to understand what happened to you. You need to understand what exactly is the problem that you're dealing with. Do we really understand the potential of the socioeconomic stress that people are experiencing? We hear a lot of, we see numbers, but do we understand? What is the role of 450 days, give and take, of COVID lockdown with limited access at some point into cigarettes, with limited access currently on liquor, with all kinds of issues? I think that plays into the anxiety that communities experience. But can we see the positive elements? Can we see where communities act in self-defense? Can we see that communities act in a constructive way, saying no looting here and things like that? Or are we just fueling the fires? Those are the questions that I'm asking about a crisis, because it seems to me there are different responses. Some people are looking and adding to the problem, and some people are saying, what can we do to resolve the problem? And those are typically the responses to a crisis. Now, I place this crisis firmly into the context of a VUCA environment. In other words, it's volatile, it is uncertain, it is complex, especially in KZN. It is not only ethnic, it is not only socioeconomic, it is not only organized crime, it is a very complex situation, and we need to understand that to deal with the problem. And then, of course, the issue of ambiguity. Sometimes things can be both right and wrong, and you have to deal with that. Now, what I'm proposing here is that we must convert the VUCA environment, which is a well-known environment to deal with in crises and pandemics, into something else. So the volatility must be transformed into a vision. In other words, you must make the uncertainty your friend. If you look at my last sentence, you'll see I'm writing, do not fight volatility, embrace it. You must transform the uncertainty into understanding. We must understand what's going on. We must convert the anxiety and the resistance into productive energy. And that's a leadership role. Then we deal with complexity, which we must transform into clarity. We must get an understanding and develop an understanding through research, through discussion, through all the mechanisms we have to deal with it. And then we must convert the ambiguity into something that we can use, such as adaptability or agility, to build some form of resilience into our response. So the critical uncertainties that I referred to in the previous slide, I just mentioned. I don't have answers to them, but I just mentioned them for consideration. Things such as, for how long will the COVID pandemic be with us? Another year, another 2 years? I just don't know. It's a critical uncertainty. Will South Africa follow the global economic upswing? Or are we going to follow the trajectory of a 1–2% growth and maybe less with the issues we experienced over the last 2 weeks? Are we in a period of policy moderation? In other words, the issues are so big that government is getting off some of its hobby horses, saying maybe we don't have to change the Firearms Act now. It's not a good time. Maybe we can wait a little bit with the issue of Section 25 of the Constitution. Next question is, when will the ruling party erode further? You'll see I use my words very selectively. I don't say when will it break apart or when will it split. I don't think that is the right language. Something will break away, but it won't be the party as such. There will be an erosion of some kind. And I think following the last 2 weeks, that is now not if, but when. Will Ramaphosa get a second term? I know he would like to have a second term, but the conditions are changing and the conditions are very challenging. Personally, if I have to make the call, I think yes, he will get it, but the conditions are very challenging. What's the future of energy? We're talking about Eskom. We're talking about oil, South Africa's dependency on oil. We're talking about renewables. Where are we going with the latest announcements? And then, of course, climate change. I'm talking to you from a very cold Potchefstroom, but I guess that is just normal winter. It's not climate change. So how do you make decisions in uncertain times as part of the parameters of change. 4 issues are important, actually 5. Pause and take a breath, literally. Take a step back and gather yourself, reconstitute yourself, and before you take a decision. Very important point. Involve more people. Very few people have all the intelligence and all the insight on themselves. Get people to surround you to help you with the thinking. Reject the hierarchical model in your organization. You know who the innovative guys are. Bring them on. Make the critical small choices. Big choices are obvious, but some decisions that seem small or routine can have large, long-term strategic implications, especially in a crisis. And then set up a nerve center. Do not call it a war room. For some reason or another, politicians in South Africa love the notion war room. War room is Second World War language. We don't do war rooms anymore. You can call it an operations room or a nerve center or something like that. And that will help you as a leader to take decisions. And empower leaders with judgment and character. Doing business as usual. Some people will get ahead, and we know them, they're for a certain type. They say the right things, they don't ruffle feathers, they know how to navigate the system, and they manage messages so that people hear what they want. We know those guys. Many of these usual suspects who typically tap into lead special initiatives are ill-suited to lead in a landscape of crisis and uncertainty. You need special people to deal with this. Make sure that you have access to that kind of people. Then there is, of course, something that in this field one must take note of, the so-called situation crisis communication theory, written about by Timothy Coombs, and he focuses very much on organizations and how crises affect stakeholders and how you must manage the fallout and you must protect your reputation. So for him, it's a communications problem in essence. I look at it a little bit broader, but it's important in this field that one must take note of the importance of communication when you're in a crisis. Crisis management is a set of factors designed to lessen the damage inflicted by a crisis. It must protect the organization, stakeholders, reputation, and the industry. And there are 4 very important issues here. Prevention, or the new, I call it the new religion in management, that is risk mitigation. It's not always visible, but it's crucial. The second thing that must be important is preparation, which includes your crisis management plan and everything that goes with that. And the question that every organization must ask, where is the reset button? If things go wrong, where do you go? Very few organizations can provide you with the reset button. And third one is response. To apply the organizational plan or the crisis plan. This one is very public. The previous 2 are very private and behind the scenes, but your response is public. And the social media, extremely sensitive to your response. And if you do the wrong things, you will know that in a very short space of time. And then, of course, revision, to evaluate the performance and to ask questions whether the communication actually worked. I've got 2 more slides and then I'm finished with my part. The next one is, in what way are you going to integrate your strategy with crisis management? And there are 6 important elements of your strategy that must be looked at if you look at crises and at disasters. What's the redundancy of your strategy? In other words, do you have more than one way of doing it? The second one is, do you have enough diversity in your strategic plan? In other words, have you developed a strategic plan that is in line with the environment where you work? The third one is the modularity of your strategy. If the crisis kind of paralyze one part of your strategy, can the others still continue? You must develop a strategy that can basically work modularly. And then the fourth part is, to what sense can you adapt your strategy in a crisis? Because the crisis changes the conditions. And if the conditions change, your strategy must obviously adapt. The fifth one is prudence, or we can just call it intelligence, or we can call it foresight. Do you have the information, and do you have enough research to tell you where things are going? It's clear that government over the last 2 weeks failed on this one. Whatever we call the issue that happened in KZN, what stands out is a massive intelligence failure of some kind. And then the embeddedness. Is your strategy embedded in the organization? Is it part of how people think about the organization, and do they know where the strategy is going? And all 6 of these need to be implemented if you really want to respond to crises in a very specific way. This comes from a very recent book published that is referred to as Your Strategy Needs a Strategy, which I thought is a very, very good version of looking differently at strategy. Let me finalize. Leadership in crisis. I've got 10 or so pointers that I took out of this presentation that I would like to share with you. The first one is an obvious one. Leaders should always lead from the top. It's given. You can't be any other place when a crisis emerges. Secondly, there is something in leadership that we can refer to as the creation of deliberate, calm, grounded optimism. In other words, your response, your language must reflect that. The third one is to disallow negativity. If you really want to solve a problem, that is not something that you can allow. And that is a leadership role. Making decisions amid uncertainty. I've mentioned this before. Pause to assess, anticipate, and then act. The fifth one is demonstrate empathy by dealing with a human tragedy as a first priority. And I think our president has shown some very good skills in doing that in 1 or 2 of his speeches. And then, of course, the team must be shown empathy by the leader. The leader must acknowledge the role the people around him is playing to give them some backup in terms of what they're doing. There must be a plan B to keep the ship from sinking, especially if you're in an organization. And I haven't seen plan B in our case. I see several plans, but I don't see plan B. Track and take control of the team's workflow, or in the South African case, the cabinet, I guess. A leader must be aware of the climate around them. They must know what's going on. That's why I asked the question previously. Are we aware of the socio-economic ills? Are we keenly aware of what people think and feel where they are in the country at the moment? Leaders must stay alert by establishing communication channels. Very important. Communicating effectively by maintaining transparency and frequent updates. In my view, there should be a daily press conference, taking questions, talking to people every day. A leader should never panic, at least not in public, but I think that's also a given. Planning is essential of leadership in a crisis, and one of the issues about leadership in a crisis is how to learn what not to do and what to do in future. Let me conclude. I've tried to cast a wide net, to share with some of the experiences I had in the past and some of the things that I think it's important for crises as well as disasters in terms of how we can deal with it in a management situation. Crises and disasters illustrate to us the fault lines in our organizations, in our systems, and in our countries. It shows us in a mirror who we are and where the problems are. And we must look at that, and we must study it, and we must find out where it's from and why it is. A crisis also demonstrates the resilience and the agility of leadership and organizations. It shows us pushback. It shows us when people is saying, not in my backyard, I'm not going to allow it here. South Africa has experienced several major crises over years. And I look back, and I just mentioned a few dates that I think qualify: 1940, 1922, 1939, 1949, 1960, 1967, or 76, 1986, 2008, and now 2021. And we have always bounced back from the precipice. That's one of the interesting things. We have been there before. And I think we've got the ability to deal with this I saw a cartoon that said the Defence Force and the police must thank the people of South Africa for saving the country, which is tongue-in-cheek, but there's a lot of truth about it. The fourth point of my conclusion is that a crisis provides unique opportunities to bring about change. Sometimes you can't do things. I've presented a suggestion on the N3, which has fallen on very fertile ground, and it seems to me now is the time to do the changes on the N3 that there was never an urgency before. Now the urgency is there. If you can do it, now is the time. And the last one, it is crucial not to be consumed by a crisis, but to maintain positive and to keep a constructive mindset. It is when the crisis consumes you that you become paralyzed and where you have a difficulty dealing with the situation as such. Ladies and gentlemen, in my short time that I provided myself, I'd like to thank you for your kind attention.